But let's go ahead and do our old crafting guide here. Let's start with white, because for some reason it gets to be the first color in the color pie. With academic probation. Now, I'm going to go ahead and tell you a lot of these lessons I don't think you should craft on day one. I think we should, in a lot of cases, with a lot of cards, we should wait and see if these do have any effects on the format whatsoever before we just go crafting them willy-nilly and wasting wild cards and stuff. So you will hear me say 0 and wait for a lot of these cards, and pretty much every lesson is in that category. If you exclusively play best of one, I think these are slightly higher priority, but we still need to figure out which ones are best. And even though I think academic probation is actually a pretty good looking lesson, it's relatively cheap. You know, it does two different things that a lot of board states would call for you wanting to do, right? You know, keep your opponent off the sweeper or an important card like Emergent Ultimatum on one mode, or just freeze down, you know, their biggest creature, their Lovestruck Beast, so it can't attack or block for a couple of cycles. That seems okay. You know, it seems all right, but still, as far as lessons go, I'm not really seeing anything that jumps out at me as like a must craft on day one. So I'm just going to say 0 for probation, but it's one of the lessons I'm kind of most interested in. I'd still wait though. But Devastating Masteries next is an interesting card, right? But I still don't think that it's quite worth crafting just yet. I think that Doomscar and Shatter the Sky probably do its job better than it does. And even though it says destroy all non-land permanents, it does cost 6 mana, a lot of it white, and there's not really a good Esper control deck or blue-white control deck in the format right now to really leverage an effect like this. And even if there was, I'm not sure that it would want to pay 6 mana for the effect. And I don't think most control decks are going to want to pay 4 mana for the effect unless they're about to die. And if you want a sweeper that keeps you from dying, then Doomscar and Shadow the Sky are just better. In a lot of cases, you know, even Shadow's Verdict, Extinction Event are just better. Even though this says destroy all non-land permanents, I still think a card like maybe Ondu Inversion is just a safer card to put in your deck, you know, less opportunity costs and all that. So I'm just not really sure where Devastating Mastery fits as much as I like the card. So I think it's a cool card with cool art, and I like that it's got my name in it and all that. But I still think it's a 0 on day one. But we move on to Elite Spellbinder, which I think is a 4. I think this is one of the better cards in the set, actually. It just does so much, and even though it looks to me like the kind of card that has flash but doesn't, I still think it's an important card for mono white aggro moving forward. It's an evasive creature that hits for a lot of damage. Once it's got a Maul of the Skyclaves on it, you kind of don't care that it's got, you know, just the 1 toughness, or a lower toughness at the very least at that point. Plus, there's lots of ways to keep this alive, you know, All Seed, Selfless Savior, and stuff like that. So I like a lot about this card, and I just think that it's one of those cards that has enough utility and, you know, slots into a deck day one that it just kind of smacks of one of those cards that will immediately impact the format in some small way at the very least. And for what it's worth, you can Coco into this in Historic and stuff. So on Arena, there's multi-format reasons to want to craft this card, and I think that this is our first and one of our only 4s in white. But I'll move on to Leonin Lightscribe, which I am tentatively assigning a 4 to. I like a lot about this card. I'm not 100% sure that the mono white or white X, you know, Magecraft deck is all it's really cracked up to be, especially with so much premium removal in the format right now and so many good sweepers. You know, I imagine if a deck like this does anything at all, then a card like Doomscar gets way, way better. You know, we have answers to a deck like this in the format already. So I'm not sure how good the deck is, but if the deck is a thing, this is easily going to be, you know, an integral part of the deck. So, and I think that the deck is worth messing around with in all of its different forms, because, you know, there's a blue-white one, there's a mono-white one, there's a green-white one, there's a black-white one. So, like, one of those is probably going to be good enough to at least attempt to do something at some point. So, although I kind of want to assign a weight to this, I'm going to say 4, because I think if there's another white, you know, creature in this set that's going to be, you know, important in standard, it's probably Lightscribe, and not even just for the mono white Magecraft decks. I think this could pop up in a couple of different things. You know, there's been a couple of reasons for Sprite Dragon to go Jeskai in the last year. So if Sprite Dragon wants to go Jeskai, it has access to this. There's a lot of reasons to craft Lightscribe. So even though it's one of my most tentative 4s in this entire video, I promise you that, I still think you should probably try and craft 4 of these if you have some wild cards left over after you craft the more important stuff. But we'll move on to Mavinda, and this is probably going to be one of my first like controversial entries, but I wouldn't immediately craft more than 1 copy of this, and I'm not even sure that I would craft the 1. I do think it's an important creature, right? I think that once you have 4 or 5 mana, it's going to act a lot like a Lurrus in that you can play it and immediately get some value, even if your opponent has a removal spell. And I think that's cool, especially if you have stuff like Fight as One or Sajiri Shelter, other like protection spells in your yard. You can use them to protect this from removal. And then at that point, you'll end up untapping with it on the battlefield. You can do some real damage. But there's a lot of opportunity cost to this. There's a lot of synergy you have to count on. It's a relatively expensive card for the deck that wants to play it. It dies to Frostbite. There's a lot of problems with Mavinda that aren't necessarily as inherent with a card like Feather, which is the thing everyone compares this to. But I honestly think that this could end up seeing like 2 to 3 up play in some decks, but it's still a card I'd want to wait on, especially considering Mythic wildcards are at such a premium, you know, they're kind of tough to come by. So this is one of those that I would wait on, and I wouldn't necessarily spend a Mythic on day one, even though I do expect this card to have some small impact on the format. I still don't, or some large impact on the format. I still think it's worth waiting until it does so to craft the card. I don't think it's a day one guarantee, but I do think it's a very good card. I do. Again, for the same reasons that I like Lurrus, I like Mavinda. I think that's worth pointing out. But let's move on to Mila, Crafty Companion. This is actually one of my favorite cards in the entire set, personally. On one side, it's a 3-mana 2/3 Fox, and whenever a permanent you control becomes a target of a spell or an ability an opponent controls, draw a card. I think that's a really, really good ability. I think that this, at least will often make this replace itself. And if you have any other creatures out, maybe they replace themselves when they die. And I think that's just a really good line of text. I also really like Reanimator decks. That's no secret. So Luca Wayward Bonder just looks like a fantastic card to me on all of its modes because I love Reanimation. However, I'm going to say 0 for this on day one or in week one or whatever you want to call it. I do think that the card is kind of good on both halves, but I don't know how good Luca is, especially at 6 mana. And Mila is just kind of okay. It's just kind of fine. It's just an okay card. Not great in terms of stats or anything. The first line of text probably won't matter for a couple of turns while it's out. So the best line of text on either half of this card is the bottom line of text. And even that, you play turn 3 Mila into your opponent turn 4 Shatters. And the card did nothing. It's just a 3-mana 2/3 that did literally nothing. So, they hit Extinction Event. They take out this and all of your Selfless Savers, All Seeds, and Speaker of the Heavens and stuff like that. And you don't get any sort of boost from this. I just think that there's a lot of fail cases that are actually relatively common in the format for this card to run into. So I would say a 0 for day one, but it is the kind of like weird janky build around that I want to mess with. But we'll move on to Selfless Glyphweaver here. Glyphweaver is actually kind of cool. On one side, it's a 3-mana 2/3 that exiles to make all your creatures get indestructible, so protect from Doomscar, Shatter the Sky, and stuff. And then Deadly Vanity is 8 mana, which is a lot. But, the Black-White Clerics decks are trying to cast Agadeem's Awakening in the late game for 7 or 8 mana sometimes. So it's usually 7 mana. They want to get Aura back. But, it's not unheard of for these Clerics decks to stall the game, get a board presence, gain some life, make it difficult for the opponent to finish. And then you get to 8 mana and you just cast this, choose a creature or planeswalker, destroy all the other creatures or planeswalkers. This actually works really well with your Aura, your Tabaraks, right? Because all your dudes will go to the graveyard. You draw some cards, you put a bunch of tokens or a bunch of counters on Tabaraks, swing in Flying Lifelink, and your opponent probably can't block, right? Because you've destroyed everything. So I think there's a couple of cool ways to win the game in Clerics with this card, but I still give this a 0 day one. I think that Clerics got some really, really cool tricks that might make that deck a little bit better, but I'm not sure that this is more than a sideboard piece. I like that it plays differently against different decks. Against Control, this is pretty good, Glyphweaver. Against Aggro, this card's pretty good, Deadly Vanity. But you might die before you can cast Vanity. And if you're playing against Control, you might be playing against Shadow's Verdict. You might be playing against Extinction Event. So this just won't be great for a 3-mana 2/3 a lot of the time. This won't do what you want it to do against a lot of decks, especially really popular decks like Sultai Ultimatum. So I'm going to say 0 for day one, but if Clerics does do anything, I imagine this will be an important sideboard card. But I wouldn't craft sideboard cards for fringe decks on day one. I just wouldn't do that. So we'll move on to Semester's End. This is an interesting looking card, but I'm going to say 0 for now. Now, this could go in Yorion decks, but more likely, I think that Yorion just overshadows this card's existence. However, this could be a 1 or 2 of in Yorion decks. I'll say that one more time because obviously if you target Yorion and a bunch of other stuff with this, well, then Yorion will blink, come back into play, and then you'll get to blink more stuff. So it's a chain reaction that, especially at instant speed, I think is going to be really difficult to beat if you've cultivated the correct board state. But at the same time, I'm not sure this is going to be worth the slot, even in an 80-card deck, because those decks are very, very tight at the moment. And I'm not sure that you want a card that sits in your hand for a majority of the game. You know, one of the good things about Yorion is that it's a body that does that thing. And the body can be blinked. You know, you can't blink a Semester's End over and over. So, you know, even though this could be an important card in kind of blink-based control decks after Yorion rotates, but until then, I think it might be a role player as a 1 or 2 of in Yorion decks if it shows up at all. So I wouldn't craft any copies of this just yet, even though this looks like it will one day be a powerful card. Probably. We'll move on to Shale, Dean of Radiance. Another interesting thing for Clerics decks, right? But I don't really see that much power on either half of this card. A 2-mana 1/1 Flying Vigilance is a cool little keyword soup, I guess, but the tap ability on it isn't actually that strong in a lot of decks, unless you're playing Conclave Mentor, and even then it's not that great, to be honest. And then the other half looks pretty cool, right? But this ability often won't do what you want it to do. I mean, you tap your 4-mana guy to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature every turn. That's a little slow, honestly. And then this, whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, draw a card. Best part of the entire card, pretty easily. And if it sees play in Clerics, it'll be because of this clause right here. But ultimately, I feel like this card is a little bit powered down from where it should be in order to craft it on day 1. So I'll give it a 0. Sparring Regimen is probably the worst white rare in the set, but I could be proven wrong about that. You know, putting a +1/+1 counter on a creature whenever you attack and giving it pseudo vigilance is kind of cool. And when it enters the battlefield, learn is not nothing. It's not nothing. I actually think I rate this learn ability a little bit higher than a lot of content creators do, but I'm still not super into Sparring Regimen as a card. I'm really not. This doesn't do much to affect the board state when it comes into play. Costs a lot of mana, sorcery speed, not a big deal. I will say it's blinkable though, and that might matter. If the card sees play, that might be why, but ultimately, I'm not a huge fan of Regimen. I'm really not. Strict Proctor. I'm going to say 0 just while Hushbringer is in the format for this card. But after Hushbringer's gone from the format in the fall, maybe you want to consider crafting this card. But, Hushbringer has the lifelink. Hushbringer does die to Stomp, and this doesn't. And if it sees play, it'll be because of that factor. I think that'll be a huge factor in this seeing play over Hushbringer. But Hushbringer doesn't see a whole lot of play to begin with. Like, I wouldn't have crafted 4 copies of Hushbringer straight away when its set came out. So I'm not really sure about Strict Proctor, even though I do like the creature types. I really do. I like both of these creature types, especially Cleric. I'm still going to say a 0 while Hushbringer's in the format. So let's move on to blue and look at what's in this color, because I don't think there's a whole lot that I'd craft on day 1 in this color either. So far, we have crafted 8 rares, 4 Elite Spellbinders, 4 Leonin Light Scribes, and maybe, possibly 1 Mavinda, if not 2. But I'm not crafting any day 1. But in blue, we look at Archmage Emeritus first. Now, Archmage is a cool-looking card. 4 mana for this text box feels like it would have been like a super popular card in 1998, but I'm not sure that, what is this, Beast Whisperer for spells, like, really holds up, especially at a 2/2 body in 2021. So even though this looks like a fun, janky card to do fun, janky things with, that's what I suggest. If you have the wild cards to craft it and you want to do stupid crap with it, go ahead and do that. But if you want to play on the ladder competitively, I don't think you need to craft any of this card. We'll move on to Dream Strix. This card I'm actually really interested in, but I still wouldn't craft any copies of it. Not week 1 or anything. I don't think that this is going to be powerful enough to do a whole heck of a lot, but I do like the package. 3 mana, 3/2 flyer. When it dies, learn. It's not bad. It's really not a bad card, but I still don't think this slots in anything like week 1 or anything, so I probably wouldn't mess around with this immediately. But we'll move on to Ingenious Mastery. This card's a stinker, I'm pretty sure. I'm actually intrigued by paying 3 for this. Yeah, the opponent gets 2 treasures and they scry 2, but 3 mana to draw 3 cards is not actually that bad, especially if you have a way of, getting a lot more mana that turn, digging through your deck and all that. 3 mana is not terrible, even at sorcery speed, but still wouldn't craft any of this. I think the card's poo-poo. So we'll move on to Jadzi, Oracle of Arcavios. I would craft 4 copies of this on day 1. I know it's Mythic and all that, but I do think it is very likely the best Mythic in the set. Both halves do something really broken. this is a fairly broken card right here, and this is a fairly broken card too. Considering if you have enough lands in your deck, probably going to include a lot of MDFCs or whatever. So, you play this on turn 3 very likely if you ramp into it, and you drop like 3 or 4 lands on the table if you built your deck correctly. So, I think that this is probably going to be a pretty important card. Of course, Simic gets a busted Mythic. Of course they do. This is currently also the most expensive card in the set, if I'm not mistaken. Does this have a price somewhere? Yeah, $42.49 for a copy of Jadzi. Because, like I said, I think it is the most expensive card in the set. I would craft 4 copies of this because it's good. It's a really, really good Magic card. Probably on both halves here, and it's going to see some play. So if you're going to craft a Mythic from the set, I'd say it should be old Jads here. Very, very stupid card. But we'll move on. By the way, Flippin' Jake, thanks for the tier 1 sub for 8 months. I appreciate that. Yeah, Jadzi Brews incoming. Trust me. We're going to have to do Jadzi Brews. The card is brutal. Multiple choice is a card that I like. I really like paying 4 or more for this. 5, basically. Although it's worth noting, if you have a Shark Typhoon out or something, you can pay whatever for this and get like a huge token off your Shark Typhoon. So that's kind of cool, right? You can just pump all your mana into it. But I like this for 5 mana, and I don't really like it for any other mana cost, but it is cool that you can, if you want to, you can, cast this for other costs. Maybe you're looking for something specific and you rip this off the top of your deck on turn 6. Pay 2 mana for an opt. It's not that bad. You can get through your deck a little faster. So I think this is a cool card in a lot of ways, and I'm interested to play with it, but I'm not interested enough to suggest that you craft any copies of it day 1. I'm going to give this a 0 for now. We'll move on to Teachings of the Archaics. This is a 0. This card isn't great in a lot of ways, even for a lesson, because it counts on your opponent having more cards in hand than you to do literally anything. And I don't like that. It seems like it would be dead a lot. So I'm not a huge fan of that. Craft 0. Tempted by the Auric. I'm tempted to tell you to craft some copies of this card. Honestly, I'm tempted to give this a 4, but for now, I'm going to give this a 0. But this is one of the cards I'm torn on the most in the entire set. Gain control of a target creature or planeswalker they control, mana value 3 or less. I actually think that is a very, very, very good rate for this ability on a sorcery, right? Not like an aura that they can break and then get their creature back. No, you get the creature forever, which is traditionally very, very good. And 4 mana is a fantastic rate, even if it's a little awkward to cast in some decks. I still think this is a very good card. Like a very, very, very good card. But I'm still going to say 0 for now because I don't know what exactly this fits into on day 1. And even nowadays, I'm not sure that downgraded control magic for a slightly harder to cast CMC is where we want to be, honestly. But I still think this is a really powerful card. But for now, I'm going to say 0 and possibly regret that decision later. But this is one of the most powerful cards in the set that I'm going to give a 0. Let me put it that way. But we'll move on to Torrent Sculptor, which is another one of the more powerful cards in the set that I'm going to give a 0. I freaked out a little bit over this card in spoiler season, and I still really like it. It's removal on one half that also counts as a milkshake. It brings a boy to the yard. You dump a creature in the graveyard or a spell or something like that, and you draw a card. So I like removal that gets you deeper into your deck and affects graveyard strategies. Everything about Flamethrower Sonata, including the killer name, is really, really cool to me. I like this card a lot. And if all else fails, you're playing against control, they don't have a target for Sonata, boom, you have a body that's difficult for them to deal with and can get bigger. So when you cast it, at least. Maybe you blink it later and make it even bigger or something like that. So I like this card, but I'm still going to say 0 because I'm not sure where it fits or if it's quite as good as I want it to be. I do think they pushed this card a little bit for standard play, but I'm not sure it fits yet anywhere. And this card, Torrent Sculptor itself, is never going to be a good creature. It's just going to be a body when you need one. That's all. It's all it's there for is when you can't cast Sonata, you have a body in the form of Torrent Sculptor. But Sonata is a really, really intriguing card that I like a lot. But I'm still going to say 0 for this because I just don't know what it has to do in week 1, but I imagine somebody will figure out what to do with Sonata eventually. It's just a really powerful card. We'll move on to Uvilda, Dean of Perfection. 0 on this, I would say. Again, intriguing card for like Jank Lords and stuff, and the other half actually looks really good to me in Asiri, Dean of Expression. This is not a bad looking card that I think actually gets bigger as the game goes on, gives you a little bit of card advantage on every turn. I like Nasiri. I really do. Uvilda, not quite as attractive in terms of gameplay function, but still an interesting card that might at some point break through into a cool thing, but I don't think you have to waste your wild cards on it week 1. So let's move into black as I again turn my head towards chat for a moment. Let's look at Baleful Mastery. Probably a little controversial here, but I wouldn't craft any of this card day 1. I think letting your opponent draw a card is pretty big. It's pretty big. And nominally, I think this is technically better than Eat to Extinction. But is it better enough to see play? And when you do play it for 4 mana, which you will do some of the time, when you play it for 4 mana, because that's just flexibility, that's all it is. When you play it for 4 mana, you kind of feel cheated that you didn't get the Surveil off of Eat to Extinction. It's effectively a Surveil. So even though some people are kind of freaking out about this card, I really don't think that I would craft too many copies of it day 1. I'm going to stick to 0 day 1, see if it does anything in tournament results. And if it does, then we'll worry about it. But honestly, I think this card is a little hype, and that's kind of all it is. Like, exile a creature or planeswalker for 2 mana is a really, really good rate. But your opponent drawing a card turns this into virtual card disadvantage for you, and I am just not a fan of that, especially if you want to drop this in control, which is where it looks the most attractive. So I'm just not sure about that one. But when you have to exile a creature or planeswalker right now and it only costs 2 mana and your opponent draws a land, you'll feel really good about that, but that's a lot that has to line up. So I'm not sold on Baleful Mastery the way a lot of people are. But we'll move on to Callous Bloodmage. This is actually one of my favorite cards in the set. Again, on a personal level, I really, really like this card. I love versatility, especially when it comes on a body, a blinkable body at that, right? With Yorion in the format, Thassa and stuff like that. This card looks really good, but I still don't think I would bother with crafting any of this day 1. This has to actually prove that it will do something in order for me to want to craft it. However, I just was telling myself the other night, I was doing something. I can't remember. I was building a deck in my head. And I was telling myself, I really wish that we had a Phyrexian Rager type card. And this is exactly that. 3 mana, draw a card, lose a life. That is Phyrexian Rager, just with 1 less toughness. And you get 2 other abilities. So I really like this card. And I think that it probably will do something just based on versatility alone. But stats are a little weak for the mana costs, and even though it does so much when it ETBs, which is usually my standard for a good card, I'm still just not really feeling it with Blood Mage in terms of like cards you absolutely have to craft right now. So I'm going to give this a 0 for now, tentatively, but I do think it's a really, really cool card. Well, I'll move on to Confront the Past, which I'm also going to give a 0. This is a card that I'm like really, really excited to play with, but I'm not sure that it's actually that great, right? I mean, it has to be in a Planeswalker deck. You have to have that Planeswalker in your graveyard, or your opponent has to have a Planeswalker in play. I guess that could happen, but can't count on that happening. You have to build your deck around this card. It probably has to be Super Friends. You have to have a Planeswalker in the graveyard. It can't cost too much mana either if you want to get it back. It's just, I don't know. It's sorcery speed. The best thing about this is that it's a lesson, and it is one of the better lessons that we've seen. In Best of 1, I do think this will be a key card in some sort of control-based decks that use lessons and learn cards, have a wish board and all that. But I still don't think this is an important card to craft day 1. And if you do craft any, I wouldn't craft 4. I'd only craft like 1 of this to throw into a wish board. So, if you're going to craft, if you must craft the card, craft precisely 1 copy of it, but you don't have to. Moving on to Auric Lore Mage. This is pretty obviously a junk rare, I think. It costs 4 mana for a creature that dies to Frostbite. You have to wait an entire turn to tap it just to put a thing into your graveyard. Then you have to have other ways of, using the thing that's in your graveyard and all that. So I'm just not sure. If you're going to do graveyard synergies right now, I think there's just better ways of doing that than Auric Lore Mage. So I'm pretty sure this is destined to be a 50-cent rare, and I wouldn't craft this immediately. Moving on to Pestilent Cauldron. This thing is dope, but I'm still not sure about it. This is another one of those cards that's so versatile that it looks like it has to be playable somewhere, but I'm just not sure we have the deck for this. For 3 mana, you get all of these options on the front half. You get 3 different things. One of them draws a card, one makes a creature, and the other one mills stuff, which isn't the best mode on the card. But making a creature just by tapping, not bad. For a 3 mana artifact, making a creature just by tapping isn't bad. But later on in the game, becoming a JM Day Tome, pay 4, tap, draw card is pretty good. And on the other half, 5 mana for a sorcery is a lot, but getting card advantage out of your graveyard, almost any permanent type, basically except for artifacts and enchantments. A lot of different permanent types on this though, and randomly gain 4 life. That's not bad either. It's really not terrible. So I do like this card. I like the spread on it. I like the versatility. I like all the different things it can do because it effectively does 5 different things. You know, it gets card advantage back from your graveyard, gains life, and then on the front half it does 3 things. That's 5 things in one card. And it seems like the kind of card that would be really good, but I'm going to say 0 for now. For now. This card has to prove itself. The card has to do some things before I'm really going to invest any rare wild cards into it if I'm saving my wild cards. So even though the card looks really spiffy, I'd still wait for it to do something before I crafted it. Moving on to Poet's Quill. Pretty bad card. A lot of people just calling it Demonic Tutor on an equipment. It's not. It's not. It just learns. It's just 2 mana to learn when it ETBs. Like, White has a card like this at Uncommon that comes on a body. So I don't know about this. I wouldn't craft any of this. Professor Onyx, maybe again, controversial. I'm not crafting any of this day 1 either. 6 mana is a lot. 6 mana is so much for a Planeswalker. You probably have to wait a turn and untap with while she's still on the table. And even then, you have to have cards in your hand. Those cards have to be instants and sorceries. You have to play like more than 1 or 2 of them to really make the Magecraft pop off. I just think there's a lot that I don't like about this card, even though I love the Magecraft ability on it. So it's effectively Tendrils of Agony. I just am realistic about it, or at least I think it's realistic. I don't think this is going to do as much in terms of the Magecraft ability as you think it's going to do when you read the card, especially considering it comes down so late in the game. Coolest thing about this is that you can get it back from your graveyard with the Blood on the Snow, and I think that might actually end up mattering. I like the abilities on the card too, but at the same time, I think 6 mana is just a little bit too much, and if I was going to craft any of these, I'd craft 1 or 2, but I don't think you even have to do that day 1. I'm going to stick with 0 for now on Professor Lily. But we'll move on to Sedgemoor Witch, the new, Young Pyromancer. Wow, I don't know why I forgot that for a second. The new Young Pyromancer, but it costs more, and it doesn't, I guess it's better than Young Pyromancer in every way, aside from the fact that it costs 1 more mana, but costing 50% more mana is kind of a huge deal. So even though I really, really like this card, like I really want to play with this card, it's probably not going to do a whole heck of a lot until turn 4. Right, it can get stomped. Even if your opponent has to pay 3 life for it, they'll probably still stomp it. I think in a lot of cases, a card like Clarion Spirit is probably just better than this. Although imagine playing both in the same deck, that'd be fun. So I'm not feeling this card for competitive ladder play. I'm not sure it's going to be part of a tier 1 deck or anything, but I do think the card is really, really cool. But I'd still not craft any copies day 1. And then Valentine, Dean of the Veen. That's what we're calling him. He really does look like the Dean from Community, doesn't he? I like this card a lot. I like this card so much that I'm going to tell you to craft 3 copies of it, even though I wasn't sure I was going to do that. Like coming into this, I wasn't sure I was going to tell you to do that. And I think this card could be a bust, but the Valentine half of it is so good. You know, 1 mana for a 1/1 with 2 keyword abilities and a relatively important creature type, or at least it will be, right? But not enough to craft it immediately. But it's this ability. If a non-token creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead. I think that 1 line of text is probably worth crafting this card. I kind of do. I like that an awful lot. It fights a lot of decks in the format. You know, from Croxa to Lurrus and all that stuff. So I really, really like this an awful lot. A whole lot. And this just tacked on to make more board presence. A 1-drop that makes more board presence later in the game. I just kind of like everything about this card, even without discussing the second half, which is pretty good. Second half isn't terrible. It's really not. Especially later in the game, you rip this off the top. This is probably better to play than a 1 mana 1/1. So at least it's got a body on it. It's not bad. But I would probably craft at least 3 copies of Valentine just for the Valentine half. I think this is a really, really cool card right here. That'll probably show up eventually. I'm not sure that it shows up in week 1. So again, this is a very tentative craft here. But I still think it's one of the better black cards in the set. And I'm probably going to end up crafting this one on day 1. Just letting you know. Although, again, this is one of the cards that I'm most reluctant about crafting. Well, I'll move on to Conspiracy Theorist. I'm going to give this a 0 on day 1 in week 1 unless you're a Jank Lord. I think that there's probably ways to break this card. This second ability on the card is busted. This is a dumb ability, but, you know, it's usually got to last at least a turn to really do much of anything. It does give all your cards madness, and that's really good, but I'm not sure that setting this up on turn 2, skipping your turn 2, exposing your board to a stomp which you'll just get bodied by if your opponent does this EOT and then casts their Bone Crusher. You're in trouble. And then on turn 3, you have to have a play that lets you discard a card and still have mana to cast the card that you discarded if you really want to get early value out of this. So I'm not sure how good this actually is. I'm really not. Even though this ability here is crazy as the game goes on, if you have a Conspiracy Theorist out for more than like 2 turns, I think you can probably do some lunatic garbage with it, to be honest, but I'm still not sure that it's quite good enough, especially in the current mono-red landscape, to really deserve a craft day 1. So unless you want to do some crazy janky stuff with Conspiracy Theorist, which is obviously what the card is for in terms of flavor and function, knock yourself out. I'm not going to tell you not to craft the card, but if I wanted to specifically focus on the latter and conserving wildcards, I wouldn't craft this card day 1, even though it's probably the most anticipated red card in the set. I still wouldn't craft it day 1. I still wouldn't do it. Crackle with Power up next. I've been wanting a sort of red X spell like this in the format, but I think this is a bridge too far in a lot of ways. I think that, there are decks out there that are super janky. They play Nyx Bloom Ancient, maybe even Replicating Ring. There are a lot of ways to generate a ton of mana in this format right now. I don't think any of them are super competitive, though, right? So I'm not sure how good Crackle is, especially considering this does not have the line, this spell can't be countered. That would really make this a lot better. But it doesn't have that line, and what do you have to put 5 mana into it? Well, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, 5 mana does 5 damage, if I'm not mistaken. I had all this math figured out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's 8 mana to do 10 damage to 2 targets. And now we're talking, but even then, I just don't think this is a great card, and I wouldn't waste Mythics on it day 1. Draconic Intervention, cool looking sweeper, but especially while Storm's Wrath is in the format, I wouldn't mess around with this. It's a sweeper that you have to enable for it to be as good as Storm's Wrath, and I don't think there's a reason for that. I really don't. It also plays too fair. It exiles itself so that your next intervention can't use the intervention in the graveyard to go by. And I think that's stupid. It wouldn't break the card if it did, but yeah, don't do this. Don't do this just yet. Until red really has no options for sweepers, I don't think it needs DI. I'm not talking about Smash Brothers. Let's look at Ifrit Flame Painter right here. This is a bad card that, again, is meant for Jank Lords and whatnot, and I think we'll probably do something really cool, but probably not too much that's super competitive. I've heard some dumb combos with this that win on turn 3 if you ramp this into play, or turn 4 rather, if you ramp this into play. But I still don't think that those are, they're all 3-4 card combos. So, even though this is relatively stalwart, 4 toughness and all that, I still think it dies to a lot of the important removal in the format, and I wouldn't base an entire deck around it. And if you don't draw your Flame Painter, you lose and all that. So I just, I don't love it. I wouldn't craft any copies of this if I was into actually winning games on the ladder. But as a jank person, we'll play plenty of this card this season, I promise you. Moving on to Fervent Mastery, a Garbo card. It's stinky. It's a poo-poo card. I don't like it. I just do not like this card. It's a triple gamble at 5 mana. And then at 4 mana, your opponent gets a windfall effect, which isn't great either. So I want to like this card, but I can't. I just can't bring myself to do it. Don't craft it. Flame Scroll Celebrant is probably my favorite red card in terms of winning games of Magic. The first half of it doesn't look super great, especially in a Robber the Rich format. That's a much better card on the front half. But at least this has, a mana sink type ability, which I think is going to be really important. And in the second half, in your Boros aggro deck, keeps your opponent from casting Shadow the Sky or Doomscar, Extinction Event or whatever. And I think that'll be really, really important occasionally for winning the game. So there's a lot I like about this card. And I will still tell you to craft 0 copies of it day 1. Because, again, I don't think it's going to be very impactful in the first few weeks of the format. I'm not sure this is actually going to be very impactful until rotation. I think Mono Red is just going to be an amazing deck till rotation. Mono Red and Mono White are going to be the reasons to play aggro. Very likely until the fall. There's not much we can do about that. I'm not sure Boros aggro is a real deck, but if it is, it will probably play this card. That said, it has to be a real deck first, and I'm not sure that it is. So I don't think I'd craft any of this card day 1, as much as I like it. Illuminate History is poopy. It's just a bad card. I shouldn't have to say much more. Don't craft that card. Plarg, another really cool card that I wouldn't craft any copies of. I don't think I'm going to tell you to craft any red cards, to be honest here. But Plarg is a sweet card that I've talked a lot about, and I'm kind of dweebed out over a few times. But I still don't think that this is a super good card. I really don't. You know, the ability costs way too much. The Anthem effect is a little bit too conditional on the other half of it, even though Augusta is really, really cool. I do think that this is a cool, like, playable card in Boris Aggro just because of that very first line of text on Augusta, but I still don't know that it's going to see too much play right away, so I don't think I'd craft any of this. Retriever Phoenix is probably the other strongest red card. It gives us a reason to play all these learn cards. And we see some really, really cheap learn cards, especially in Boros, and again, especially in red. You know, there's a 1 mana card that learns at sorcery speed, and that's probably going to be a key piece, critical piece in a Phoenix deck. And I do think Phoenix is really good. I do think Phoenix is actually a really good Magic card. I don't think I'm crafting any copies of it day one. I really don't. I think that if there is a learn deck out there that's worth playing, it's going to be in large part due to this card. I think this card helps the learn mechanic tremendously. Just the fact that this thing exists. That said, unless you're really all in on wanting to play a learn deck, I wouldn't craft this day one because it really only goes in the one deck. You know? And that deck might not actually be that powerful. So I'd wait and see if Phoenix does anything first. But moving on to Rowan/Will. This is, I think, an underpowered Planeswalker on both sides for the mana cost. If you can get the ultimate off on Rowan, I think that's really good. I think the ultimate is probably the best part of either half of these cards. That said, Will is just the better card in terms of like overall gameplay performance a lot of the time, I would imagine. He's got better abilities, a higher loyalty, and all that. So I kind of like both halves of these, but I do think both are significantly powered down. And this is one of those cases where I don't think both halves having some versatility, or just the fact that it's double-sided, creating versatility in the first place, is really going to be enough to push the card into playability. As cool as I think the card is, right, I think a double-sided Planeswalker is really, really cool. I'm still not sure this is worth a Mythic wild card or 2 or 3 or 4, God forbid. So, again, I'd wait for this. I don't think there's a deck that this really drops into day one that needs it. I would wait on Rowan and Will. Cool-looking card. I don't think it's worth it, though. So we'll move on to green after I turn my head at the chat. Patiently awaiting the Craft 4 Blex recommendation. Recursive Intrigue? We'll see. We'll see about that. Accomplished Alchemist is our first green card. I would not craft any of this. The card looks really, really cool, don't get me wrong, but 4 mana is a lot, even with the 5 toughness. 4 mana is so much, and you have to enable it past that. You know, if I have to play a card and then wait to untap with it, give my opponent a whole turn to kill it, I want it to win the game a lot of the time, or at least, you know, push us a long way towards winning the game. Alchemist doesn't necessarily do that, and you have to enable it beyond just casting it and waiting a turn. I think it's a fairly bad card. Might be really good in Brawl, but even in the Selesnya life game deck, I don't think you play that card. But moving on to Augmenter Pugilist. I actually kind of like this card just because of this half. Echoing Equation. This is the jankiest card in the entire set. Actually, there is one card that gives it a run for its money, and that's Double Major, but close to Double Major is Echoing Equation. If you want to be a jank lord, this is the card for you. And honestly, Augmenter Pugilist isn't terrible. You know, 3 mana, 3/3 trample that becomes an 8/8 later on in the game. It doesn't seem like a bad card. This is one of the better green cards, I think, but I still wouldn't craft this on day one. Wouldn't do it. I'd wait. I would wait. Even though I do think this Echoing Equation could be possibly broken, but I think it's really, really expensive. And you have to have, you know, a creature out, preferably a legendary, that your opponent doesn't kill. So I don't love it. Moving on to Basic Conjuration. A fairly bad lesson that doesn't affect the board state in any way, so I'm not a huge fan. But it does gain you 3 life. So I guess it tries to make up for not doing anything with the board state. But I still don't love Conjuration. I'll give it a 0. Here's Blex, everybody. Blex is a 3 mana 3/2 that when it dies you gain 4 life. Search for Blex is a 4 mana sorcery that lets you draw cards effectively at the cost of life. So it's kind of Sylvan Library-ish, I guess it kind of reminds me of. Now, I'm very torn on this card. This is probably the other card that I'm like most torn on in this set. We've seen a couple so far. One was the Leonin Lightscribe, which I tentatively gave a 4 to. And then Valentine, I tentatively gave a 3 to. This is a Mythic, so it's even harder to make this decision. But I do think this is a very good Magic card. 3 mana for a 3/2 is not great, but even if it gets Bone Crushered, you gain 4 life. Like, you gain back in life 1 Bone Crusher attack step. It's kind of an interesting, you know, oh wow, my hair is ridiculous. Kind of an interesting way to look at things. That's much better. Nobody told me. That's going to look fun on YouTube. But yeah, I will say the card looks really cool. And I love the fact that there's a dies trigger in case it does die to stomp. The problem is it dies to stomp. You know, I'm not sure what other pests, bats, insects, or snakes, spiders, and all that you'll be playing. So this is one of those cards that looks like you want to build your deck around it and play a bunch of other of these creature types. But I don't think you actually have to do that in order to make the card good. I think that's the tertiary value on the card, is giving your pest +1/+1 or something like that. I have wanted an Anthem effect for specifically these types, especially spiders and insects, for a good long while now. So I love Blex. And I will probably craft a 4 of this card. Again, very, very tentative here because this card could do literally nothing. This card could do nothing. However, and the other problem I have with it is by the time you cast Search for Blex and you want to draw 2 or 3 cards, well, you're paying 4 mana to not affect the board state. You draw 2 cards, you lose 6 life, you die to aggro when you say go. I don't love that in modern day Magic. I really don't, but I do think there are going to be decks that in the later game can draw a card off the top 5 for 3 life and it won't matter. And there are times where you can draw 2 or 3 cards and it won't matter, especially if you're going to die next turn anyway, right? I'm going to die next turn anyway, you know, because my opponent has 16 on the board. So I might as well, if I have extra mana left over after searching, I might as well cast Search for Blex, pay, you know, 9 or 12 life or whatever. And then, you know, draw cards to try to get to a sweeper or something. So I think there's going to be plenty of reasons to use this card, even though it looks like it's a pretty hefty fee. So I would craft all 4 of this because I like both halves of it. Even though I don't love 3 mana 3/2s right now, the dies trigger really attracts me to this card. And I think there might be better green 3-drops in some ways, but I'm not really sure about that. Like, I'd probably rather play this than Yorvo in a lot of decks, for instance. So, and it's more splashable than Yorvo, obviously. Green is kind of at a deficit of really, really playable 3-drops right now. We tried a bunch of different stuff, Garrick's Harbinger and whatnot. And I think Blex might be what we need, especially if we're looking to extend the game in our food deck or something like that. Food gains so much life that I could imagine the Search for Blex being an unbelievable half of this card in a food deck. So there are decks that could really, really like this card a lot. So I'm going to say 4 copies of this, but again, I've spent so long talking about it because it's one of the cards I'm most torn on in the entire set. But I'm going to reluctantly say craft 4 copies of Blex. I am, but... Move on to Dragon's Guard Elite, a card that I really like. One of the better Kyrian Dryad cards we've ever seen, but I still wouldn't craft any copies of this. Very likely Sprite Dragon is just a much better card than this, so I wouldn't craft any copies of Dragon's Guard Elite. Moving on to Ecological Appreciation. This is probably the toughest to evaluate card in the entire set. And I'm not talking about from a how many do you craft standpoint. I'm just talking about a how do you play it standpoint, right? You want X to equal 4 here. That way you get 8 mana value for 7 mana. That's the way that it pays for itself. If X equals 3, that's, you know, 6 mana for 2 3-mana guys. So you're at mana parity there, and it's still worth playing, right? Problem is, you have to play 4 different 4-drops in your deck. You have to play 4 different 3-drops in your deck. So this looks like a Brawler Commander card where you have a lot of different options on the curve. However, in Standard, I could see this working out too. It's not really like a Collected Company or anything. It's sorcery speed. It costs a buttload of mana. You know, if you pay 5 mana for it, you go get 2 2-drops, which is not very good mana value. But depending on what 2-drops you're getting, right, could be really, really good. So even at 5 mana, this is somewhat attractive. And I think it probably does something in Standard. The only thing I don't like is that your opponent gets some sort of agency with this card. I will be crafting this card day 1, but I don't think you should. I think that we should all, if you're conserving your wild cards, especially considering it's Mythic, you should wait and see if this card really does anything or if it's a flop. Because this card could be a flop. It really could. And not really do much of anything, especially while the ultimatums are in the format. Ugin the Spirit Dragon, you know, if you're going to spend this amount of mana, there's probably better ways of doing it. However, I could see this in Yorion decks and stuff. You can go get a Yorion for 1 million mana. You know, you'd have to play a lot of 5-drops in your deck. But if you had a Yorion in play or a Yorion in your hand or in your companion slot, go get a bunch of 4-drops, go get a bunch of 3-drops, all of which have ETB triggers, and then repeat those ETB triggers with a Yorion. Like, the card looks really, really powerful. It just looks like it takes all day, too. So I'm just not really sure about this card, and I think there might be better expensive cards in the format to spend your mana on. That said, it looks like a supremely breakable card that at some point someone will do something stupid with, I imagine. So I think you'll probably end up crafting this card. I just wouldn't do it on day one. So I'll move on to Exponential Growth here. Exponential Growth is a bad card. It just is a bad Magic card, especially with Primal Growth in the format, or Primal Might in the format. Don't craft it. It's bad. Pretty easy. Gnarl Professor is 4 mana for a 5/4 Treefolk Druid with Trample when it ETBs Learn. This is a good card, but I still wouldn't craft it. I still don't think I'd craft this card day one. I'm going to give it a 0. We'll wait and see how good Learn is and whether or not the Learn deck even plays green, because the Learn deck has to be relatively heavily invested in green to play this card, and I'm not sure that it will be. I think it's going to be more of a control deck that plays like blue, black, and possibly white. So, you know, I could see like Esper Learn or something like that, but I don't know. Even though this is a very strong Learn card, I'm just not sure about this one. The best thing about it is that it's a milkshake in green, right? It just puts a card from your hand into your graveyard, and there's probably plenty of ways to make that decent. But we just saw like Battle Mammoth in the last set that didn't do anything, and this looks like mostly a downgraded Battle Mammoth, so I'm not a huge fan. Then we have Cayenne, although I've been instructed this is probably Kiana. You probably pronounce this Kiana, so I apologize if Cayenne is incorrect. I wouldn't craft any of this card. I just wouldn't do it. I do like Ibrahim, or Ibrahim. Just call him Abraham. I do like Ibrahim, but I think this card is also a little bit slow, all things considered. And I'm not sure either of these are going to do much in standard, so I probably wouldn't craft this day one. Moving on to Verdant Mastery. I actually really like this card a lot more than a lot of people do, which I've already made very clear. I know most people hate this card. But I think the fact that on turn 4, it puts your 7th land into your hand, right? You go and get 2 lands like a Migration Path or something. But then it also puts an extra land in your hand to make sure you hit Ultimatum next turn. I think that's something that a lot of people are missing about this card that makes it playable, but I still wouldn't craft it day one. I would like to wait and see if I am correct in that assumption before actually crafting this card. Right? I'm not that confident in my evaluation. So I'd wait. You know, while we do have Migration Path and a couple of other cards in the format, this might not see any play, but I do think it's better than a lot of people think it is. But let's look at the chat here. What have you been saying? But we will move on to the gold cards. We're kind of round in the corner here. Let's look at Blot Out the Sky. This is X and a black and a white for a sorcery speed thing that makes a bunch of tapped creatures. Even though the creatures fly, I think the word tapped, makes this card like pretty bad, right? And black and white doesn't really have the mana generation of the other colors, so I'm not even sure you're going to cast this for more than 3 or 4. But I do kind of like the way it scales. If you cast this for 3 mana, you get 6 flying power on 3 bodies. If you cast it for 5 mana, X equals 3. You get 6 flying power on 3 bodies, and that's not bad. But I'm still pretty sure that the card is not good enough to see a whole lot of play. I wouldn't waste Mythics on it. If you're gonna spend Mythic wildcards, I think there's just a lot better things to be doing that with in this set, so I wouldn't do any. Moving on to Dramatic Finale, another cool janky looking card that I think there's probably cool stuff to do with, but I wouldn't craft any copies of this day one either. I wouldn't do it. Moving on to Extus Auric Overlord, one of my favorite cards in the entire set on a personal level. I want to make this work. I really think that it's probably better than people think it is, especially Awaken. I think this half of the card is actually kind of a blowout, honestly. But I still wouldn't craft any copies of this day one either. You know, Mardu mid-range or Mardu Sacrifice, not really that much of a deck right now. And of course, it could get the pieces that it needs. It could have the pieces that it needs, but I think that's highly unlikely. So even though this is a really freaking cool card, and I think both halves of it are really cool, I wouldn't waste Mythic Wildcards if you're trying to conserve them on this on week 1. So move on to Shadrix Silver Quill. Really think they shafted the Shadrix here, man. Like, Silver Quill is my favorite, or at least black-white is my favorite color combination of the 10 two-color color combinations. Black-white is my favorite, but I think this is one of the most disappointing Elder Dragons, and I wouldn't craft any copies of this. Silver Quill Command I don't love. 4 mana for a sorcery is already bad, and then even though you do get to choose 2, none of these options really feel like they're worth 4 mana put together at sorcery speed. Silver Quill Silencer. I really like this card. I want to tell you to craft 4 copies of Silencer, but I don't know that you have to. You know, it pretty much specifically goes into the Cleric's deck, unless there's some sort of black, white, or Esper aggro deck that's outside of the Cleric's subtype. I think this is mostly a card for the Cleric's deck, and if Cleric's isn't good, this card probably doesn't see too much play. It's worth noting you can Coco into it in Historic, which might be a thing that you want to do, but even then, your opponent still gets to cast the spells. You know, they just lose 3, you draw a card, which is good, really good, but they still get to cast spells. It's not like this is a meddling mage or anything, so... You know, I have some issues with Silencer. I really like this card an awful lot. I will be playing Black-White Clerics in week 1, probably on stream, to see if that deck is any good. And if it is, I think Silencer is a big part of it. But this card basically has to, like, elevate that deck almost by itself, and I'm not sure it does that. So I would not necessarily craft any copies of this, and it looks like one of the better cards in the set. But I still would, it may be a bust. I would not craft too many copies of this day 1. So move on to Vanishing Verse, which I would craft 4 copies of day 1. Maybe not 4. I think you could probably be safe crafting 2 copies of this card. Because I don't think that it's a 4 of card. I really don't. I think that in control decks, it's very likely a 2 of at the very most. Maybe more copies in the sideboard if you know you're playing against mono red or mono white or anything. But even against those decks, it doesn't kill a Faceless Haven. Doesn't do that. So, you know... I think that the card is very, very good. I think the word permanent on it is unfreaking believable. I think it's probably the best piece of removal in the entire set, but that doesn't mean you have to craft 4 copies. I would start with 2 copies of this and then add as you went on. But moving on to Culmination of Studies, a very bad card. Don't craft this. It's bad. Elemental Expressionist, same. I would not craft this card. Looks really interesting. It does, and if you play it with 5 mana and a 1 mana thing in your hand, then it's probably okay, but... You know, still, you're just getting a 4/4, vanilla 4/4, that if your opponent tries to kill it and you have mana and a card in your hand, which you won't always have, both of those things at the same time. But if you do, then you get another vanilla 4/4 out of it, which no longer has this ability, and that's, I don't know, it's just not, it doesn't seem very good to me. Galazeth Prismari is next, though, and I am going to go ahead and say to craft 4 of these. I'm not sure how many copies a deck is going to play, and it's worth noting there's not really a deck this slots into immediately, other than maybe like Is It Control or something, but I don't even know if Is It Control plays this. I really don't. It's also worth noting that this is kind of comparable to Goldspan in some ways, and in some ways even takes up a slot on the curve with Goldspan. I know, it costs 4 mana, but think about it this way. When you cast Goldspan Dragon, you can attack with it, you get a treasure token. Or your opponent targets it with a Heartless Act, you get a treasure token, pop the treasure token for 2, while the Heartless Act's on the stack, you have 2 mana, negate the Heartless Act. That's how that playline usually goes. With Galazeth Prismari, what you want to probably do if you have negate or some other counter magic up or whatever, is cast it on turn 5 after you play that 5th land. You cast it, it comes into play, you get a treasure token. That way you have 2 mana for that negate. So in a way, it takes up your turn 5 on the curve. I have thought a lot about this card. And even though I still think you probably craft 4 copies of this. I think this is the best Elder Dragon in the set, even at a relatively crappy stat line. 4 mana for a 3/4 flyer is not the best thing we've ever seen. But the ETB trigger is incredible. The second line of text is incredible as well, just with treasure tokens, which it generates on its own by coming into play. But obviously works really well with Goldspan Dragon, Maze Mine Tome, and a couple of other things you might just have laying around. So Prismari looks really, really good to me, and even though, again, the stat line is a little bit weak, the ETB trigger is good enough that I think this might be a 4 of. Now, this card looks underwhelming to some people, and I can tell you that without even looking at the chat. I imagine this card looks somewhat underwhelming to some people, but I think the ETB trigger is really, really powerful, and I like that it's going to give you some value, even if your opponent has something to do about it, but they won't always. You know, this doesn't die to Glass Casket, it doesn't die to Frostbite, it doesn't die to Eliminate, so there's some things I like about this card in the format, too. It's just altogether decent. If your opponent does kill it, they leave behind a treasure token, and, you know, your Goldspan Dragon the next turn, that's 1 less removal spell it has to worry about. So I am a fan of this card, and even though I don't think it's incredible, I still think it's one of the mythics that I think has the highest chance of pushing into standard play in the entire set. So with that in mind, I would probably craft 3 to 4 copies of Galazeth Prismari. However, I will say this has a chance to be slightly more underwhelming than I'm saying right here. But I love the ETB trigger, and I especially do love the second line of text on it too. So big fan of Galazeth Prismari. I think you should craft this card. But Moving on to Magma Opus. I don't think you should craft this card, at least not in week 1 or anything, and not while we have ultimatums in the format. I think they'll just be better than this, but the instant speed is very, very tempting on this card, but it doesn't win the game outright when you cast it, so it's probably not actually that good. That said, board presence, card advantage, removal or hit them in the dome for 4. Like, it all looks really good. And if all else fails, you can discard it for a treasure. So I actually really, really like this card a lot more than some people do. But I still wouldn't waste my time crafting it week 1 when you have better mythics to craft. Let's just put it that way. But we'll move on to Prismari Command, my favorite command, it would turn out. This is fairly easily my favorite command. I think what I like about this is the ability to both affect the board by Bone Crusher gianting a thing, stomping a thing. You can just cast Shock while also drawing 2 and then discarding 2, which I think is going to be the most popular way to use this card. But you can also create a treasure and dome a thing for 2. Create a treasure, draw 2, discard 2 if you're looking for a sweeper or something like that. That way, if you don't have enough lands to cast the sweeper, you can ensure that you get the mana to cast the sweeper, and you can dig deep enough into your deck to get to it. I think that's important. The instant speed is especially important. The ability to blow away Ember Cleaves when your opponent drops them on their turn during their combat step, the ability to blow up great hinges at the end of your turn while also killing that creature or drawing 2 or whatever, I just think that everything about Prismari Command is good. Every mode on the card is usable, I should say. And when you have the ability to use 2 of the modes, that's incredible. And sometimes this will be a main deckable way to blow up artifacts, something I'm always welcoming towards. So I really like Prismari Command, and I will shill for it. I think it is the best of these commands, and I would craft 4 copies of this day 1. I do think that it's worth that. I do. We'll move on to Beladros Witherbloom, another card a lot of people are freaking out about. Pay 10 life, untap all lands you control is undeniably insanely powerful. That is really good. Even at 10 life, it's very steep, right? And you're probably not going to do it more than once, but a lot of times once is all you're going to need. And this is a pretty cool reanimation target. And it's probably, I think it's the most expensive Elder Dragon. I'm not 100% sure on that. But I do think this is the most expensive Elder Dragon. Let me check the price on this real quick. This is, $25 for the normal one, and then extended art with the alternate art too. Oh, it's really pretty. Is $50. So $25 for this guy is relatively expensive. Sweet Brawl Commander, sweet Commander for what that's worth, and a cool reanimation target. And it's really not that hard to ramp to 7 mana, at which point you just pay 10 life, untap all your lands, and it's like this guy was free, right? So I think this is a really, really good card, but I'm gonna say 0 copies, okay? Even though it has this really, really sweet, what am I thinking? Ability on it. Oh crap, Verdant Force ability on it that I really like. It creates a token every upkeep, even your opponent's upkeep. I think it's really, really good, but I'm crafting 0 of this. I know I'm crafting 4 of the Prismari Dragon and 0 of this, which sounds crazy, but I honestly have a little bit more faith in just the inherent playability of the red-blue one than I do the green-black one. I do think this is an important creature that will see play, because if you have the life, it's effectively a free 4/4 flyer, and you might not even use it that way. You may wait until your next turn, tap all your lands, untap all your lands, tap all your lands, and do something crazy. I do think the card is unbelievable, but I'm not crafting any copies day 1. I will wait and see about Witherbloom, but we'll move on to Culling Ritual here. I'm not crafting any copies of this card week 1 either. I love that it's each non-land permanent with mana value 2 or less, and I think this is probably Commander playable, where it blows up all the rocks and small creatures and stuff. The best thing about this card, I'll say this, okay? You play it on turn 4, you want a sweeper to be turn 4, traditionally. You want it to be turn 3, whatever, but if you can't get that, turn 4 is fine. This will blow up a bunch of stuff. Now, it's not going to be good against Selfless Savior. It's not going to be good against Seasoned Hallowblade. And those are things you have to worry about. So I just think a sweeper not having an exile clause on it is just plain old bad right now. So there's that to worry about. But the cool thing about this is that if you play it on turn 4, there's pros and cons. You play it on turn 4, you're probably going to blow away a lot of your opponent's creatures. Their turn 1 drop, their turn 2 drop, you're blowing those away. If they went with turn 1 creature, turn 2 Clarion Spirit, turn 3, 2 smaller creatures, in order to get a token off of Clarion Spirit, this is really good. You know, this is fantastic in that case, because you're going to blow up their entire board, get like 4 mana off of it. The spell was effectively free. That's wonderful Christmas land for you, my friend. But, you know, there's other decks this isn't very good against. It doesn't do anything against control. It won't even ever make you mana. Against mono white, it's not as good as you want it to be because their creatures are indestructible a lot of the time. Against mono red, it's just okay, but they do have 3-drops like Anax this doesn't touch, and Torbrand and Phoenix of Ash. You know, if your opponent drops a 3-drop and then you play Culling Ritual, you're still behind. But maybe Ritual will give you the mana to play a removal spell against their 3-drop. But still, even then, I don't love that play line. You're really spending a lot of cards, right? So I think Ritual is really cool, but I just think Extinction Event's going to be the premier 4-mana sweeper until it rotates out in these colors. So I wouldn't touch Ritual right now, but I will acknowledge this has the ability to be a very good card. That said, if you want to control how much mana this actually gives to you, you probably have to play with a lot of creatures yourself. Otherwise, you can't really guarantee this is going to give you any mana or be any good, right? So I imagine a lot of time it's going to pay you back at least 2 mana, and that seems fantastic. So I want to like this card a lot, and I think there's definitely board states the card is very, very good. Matchups, the card is very, very good, but I don't know that it's worth crafting on week 1 until we know for a fact that this card has enough good matchups to be in a deck. And even then, it's probably just going to be a sideboard card, I would imagine. So we'll move on to Demogoth Titan. I wouldn't craft this. Big old Timmy creature, Timmy boy. And even though it's 4 mana for an 11/10, that gives Gary 4 black pips. You know, that is something I like. I still don't think I'd waste any wild cards on that. Harness Infinity is one of my favorite cards in the set. 7 mana to exchange your hand in graveyard, which is dumb. It's a really good card. That seems like a very good card to me, but I'm still not crafting any of this. I think if you're spending 7 mana in these colors, you're casting Emergent Ultimatum, and that's really all there is to it. Now, you might slide 1 copy of this into the Ultimatum deck, but you can't cast it off of Emergent Ultimatum. I think that's crap. So I'm just not really sure where the card fits immediately, and I don't think it's a day 1 craft. Rush Rebirth is much the same. I think this is one of the more powerful looking cards in the entire set. I really do, but you know, it kind of reminds me of Fiend Artisan in some way. You know, the card actually has to have a powerful thing to do in order to be powerful, and I'm just not really sure the card has the supporting cast to be good enough in week 1. However, if there's one card from this set that spawns an entirely new deck we've never seen before, it might be Rushed Rebirth. I can see this card seeing a lot of play, especially in historic and older formats, but again, 0 for this week 1. I wouldn't bother crafting this immediately. Let's look at Witherbloom Command, another one of the strongest commands. Still wouldn't craft it. Not week 1, at least, you know. I really, really like this one. Destroy target non-creature, non-land permanent, mana value 2 or less. I think that's a really good mode on the card. I really, really do. But I still don't think this is a good enough card all in all to day 1 craft. But we'll move on to the Boros cards, or I guess the Lorehold cards. Blade Historian. This card is really good, but I'm still not crafting any on the first week. Actually, I'll probably craft some on the first week, but you don't have to. Mono-white Clerics, maybe, but I don't think black-white Clerics can fit this. I think there's an argument for Mardu Clerics. And if you do play Mardu Clerics, maybe you play this card. Because they don't have access to a card like, you know, Torbrand or something. I guess technically they do, but they're not going to play Torbrand. And I think that a card like Torbrand is probably going to be better than this a lot of the time. And just a card like Embercleave on turn 4 is probably better than a card like this a lot of the time. Even though, you know, Embercleave just gives the 1 creature double strike, but it comes out of nowhere after your opponent makes blocks. And I think that's just like way better. So I think maybe after rotation, Blade Historian will be really, really cool, but I don't think I'll craft this card just yet. I don't think that I would if I was conserving wild cards, even though it looks super sweet to drop on turn 4 and just get in. And maybe the Clerics deck wants it, but I still think there's just better ways. I don't think this is how the Clerics deck plays. And if you're playing mono white or mono red, there's just probably better turn 4 plays than that. So I'm not super into Blade Historian. I want to be though. Moving on to Hoffreed Ghostforge. This is actually, I think, again, a fairly expensive card in the set, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, $7. That's not terrible, but $7 is not cheap either, I guess. I guess it's just because it's a mythic. This is a cool looking card, but again, it's just cool looking. I don't think I would craft any of this, especially considering it's mythic. You know, we got Nightmare Shepherd, we got Luminous Broodmoth in the format, and for 4 mana, those do very similar things and don't see any play. So I really don't think that the ability is worth it at 5 mana outside of a singleton format. So even though we're probably going to do some like really janky stuff with Ghostforge, I don't think that it's worth, in a competitive mindset at least, crafting any number of this card in week 1. Moving on to Lorehold Command, again, I wouldn't craft any of this. It's 5 mana. And even though it's 5 mana at instant speed, I don't know that it's worth 5 mana. That's very, very steep for what you're actually getting out of this. But there is a lot of versatility on the card, and it does some really cool stuff. I really like this Perilous Research ability, you know, sacrifice a permanent, draw 2 cards. I think that's really sweet on a Boros card. But I still think 5 mana is way too much in terms of opportunity cost, too. Like, you know, you have to play the kind of Boros deck that doesn't have access to a better card than this, you know, that does something similar in a different color. And also doesn't mind paying 5 mana for the ability. I just don't know that that deck exists. It may. I'm not seeing it. Move on to Radiant Scroll Wielder. You know, Boros got a lot of really fun-looking cards in this set that I nonetheless wouldn't craft. This, even though it does have this cool, like, Firesong and Sunspeaker first line of text on it, you still have to wait a turn to untap with it and play to actually do much of anything with it, right? So I'm just, I don't love it. It is card advantage in a way. That's very good. But again, you have to wait till your next turn to untap with it. And then this might take up all your mana for that turn. I don't know. I want to like this more than I do, but I don't really think it's destined for competitive play. Velamachus Lorehold is the Lorehold, like, I guess he's what the whole school is named after. He's the Boros Elder Dragon. This is one of my favorite Elder Dragons, but I don't think it's super powerful. I think this is a reanimation target. Above all else, you reanimate this into play early. I don't think you ever want to play 7 mana for this. Because if you get to 7 mana, you might as well cast it. But this is a reanimation target if I've ever seen one. And as one of those, this actually makes me really excited. But if I was just a normal player, like I couldn't write this crap off of my taxes or whatever, then I wouldn't craft any of these in week 1. Again, there's some really hot mythics in this set. And if you have mythic wildcards to burn, I wouldn't burn them on this. I would burn them on the better cards in the set first. We'll move on to Venerable Warsinger. Possibly a little bit controversial, but this is a 0 as well. I wouldn't craft any copies of this. It could do something cool, but I will wait until it does something cool in order to craft it. I don't think it's something you have to craft right now. Body of Research is much the same. I know a lot of people are obsessed with this card. This is the thing you want to fling. This is the thing you want to Kazul's Fury. I like give Trample and then cast Unleash Fury to double its power, but at that point I don't think it matters. Like this thing is going to be anywhere between like a 25-25 and a 45-45 when you cast it, and I'm pretty sure both of those numbers are more or less the same in terms of effect on the game state. But I still don't love this. You know, 6 mana for a body that just dies is not something I'm super into. 6 mana is really steep. It's difficult to cast. It only goes in Simic and no other decks. I don't love it. I want to like this, but I don't. Everybody else does. I'm not a huge fan. So we'll move on to Double Major. I am a huge fan of this, but only really from a janky perspective. What this actually does is add 2 mana to the cost of any creature you happen to be casting at the time. And so if you want to cast an Orvar and copy it, then it costs 6 mana to do that. It's too much. Even if you're trying to cast like a 2 mana legend, and so you have to wait until turn 4 to drop your 2 mana legend, it's probably not good enough. I don't know. I'm just not too sure about this. I think that it's going to be the jankiest card ever. And we'll see like Mono Black Magic on his YouTube channel play this card in like every single deck probably. But I don't think it's a very competitive card at the end of the day. So move on to Kasmina. Maybe this is slightly triggering, but I don't think you craft any of this either. Altogether, I think that this last ability is extremely good. I think this last ability is unbelievably fantastic. And it's especially good on Planeswalkers with a high loyalty when they come into play because you can get them to the ultimate faster. And I think that's good. I also think it's cool to give Planeswalkers without a +2 a +2. Planeswalkers that don't have a plus ability at all now have pluses, like the 6 mana Garruk now has a plus ability. So I think there's a lot of cool stuff about this card, but it basically requires Super Friends, and while it's out, it's bad. You know, like the first turn it's in play, you get a 1/1, and it goes down to 1 loyalty, and that's like probably not great. It might be better than I'm rating it, but I still don't think it's super great, and I wouldn't craft any copies of this until, again, it proves itself, because I think this might be a junk Planeswalker even at 3. The best thing about it is that it does create a creature when it comes into play and leaves behind a Planeswalker for just 3 mana, but that's a board state I imagine your opponent's going to be able to do something about a lot of the time, so I'm just not super into this card. And even though it's probably one of the better Mythics I'm telling you not to craft, I still wouldn't bother with it immediately. So we'll move on to Manifestation Sage here. Bad card, don't craft it. Do I have to say more about Manifestation Sage? It's bad, don't do it. I mean, I guess this does give you, you know, up to 7, 8, 9, up to 9 power for 4 mana on 2 bodies. I still wouldn't do it. Actually, it could give you as much power as you want if you have that many cards in your hand. But it's still not worth it. Don't craft this card. Quandrix Command is really, really interesting. I'm going to say craft 0 of this, but I think this could be a format-defining card. I think it's possible this is a format-defining card. It's really, really good. You know, bounce a creature or planeswalker to its owner's hand. Counter artifact or enchantment spell is probably the least used mode on it. But 2 counters on a creature, or target player shuffles up to 3 cards from their graveyard into their library. So return a creature to their owner's hand and do another thing is probably going to be the most popular way of using this card. And if your opponent tries to like land Embercleave during their combat step, you just blow them out. You know, like, oh, counter your Embercleave and return your Annex to your hand. Whoops, you lose. Like, this card could be really, really good, but it also doesn't do much on every board state in every game state. So, you know, I'm not the biggest fan of it or anything, but I do think it's a card that could do some really cool stuff. It just has to have the right deck. I don't think it slots directly into like Ultimatum, for instance. So I'm just not sure where the card goes or if it's quite good enough outside of a sideboard application, but it does so many cool things, affects the board state while also making your creatures bigger or countering a thing affecting the stack, or just getting important cards back. Just the card does a lot of things. Even though the last mode isn't amazing, I still think the card is good, but I'm still going to tell you 0 until it proves itself here. We'll move on to Tanazir Quandrix. This is, to me, the most boring of the Elder Dragons. I wouldn't do it. It has immediate effect on the battlefield when it comes into play, and it's blinkable to some pretty interesting effect. But I still don't think I would do this. It's just there's better things to be doing in Simic. So let me look over at the chat, and then we'll cover the colorless cards, and then we'll basically be done. We'll start with Cody, Vociferous Codex. I'm going to tell you to craft a copy of this card. Like just one copy of Cody. I don't think this is going to be super competitive, but I just can't resist. I cannot resist crafting a copy of this and playing Brawl with it or something. However, I think in Standard, there's actually a case for Cody. I really do, guys, because you play it on turn 3, it survives Frostbite or whatever, you know, it survives some damage-based removal spells. And then on turn 4, you can immediately do stuff. Turn 4, play a land, pay your 4, tap it, add 5 mana, cast a spell, and then get an extra spell on turn 4. And I actually think that's really powerful. I really kind of think it's powerful. You play this on turn 3, and it is relatively likely you untap with it. Now, you might not. It's just like all the other cards, you know, you have to untap with it for it to actually do anything. And I hate that about Magic cards, traditionally. But this is relatively cheap, and I like that about it. Any deck can play it. You can play a whole range of instants and sorceries, and it just gives you extra value when you cast your next one the turn after it comes into play. I think there's a case for this card in Standard, but I don't think it's super powerful. However, I'm crafting one, if only for Brawl purposes and to play around with the card. And if there's one card I think you should craft to lab, and in a lot of these cases I've said if you want to lab with this card, you can, right? But you don't have to craft it. I think you should craft a copy of Cody. I think you should. I think it's just for your own sanity and fun. I think you should craft a copy of Cody. We'll move on to Mascot Exhibition. Don't craft this card unless you're super best of 1 heavy. If you only play best of 1 and you're interested in the learn mechanic, I think this is probably one of the best learn cards. Like in the top 3. This just wins the game in the late game, or at least that's its purpose. It might not, but you know, it's a lot of board presence in the late game. It's kind of like an Amiria's Call for the learn deck. Any color can play it. I like a lot about this card, and the only reason I like it so much is because it doesn't go in your main deck. If this used literally any main deck opportunity cost, I wouldn't be into it, but the fact that this just slots into your board and, you know, 1 out of every 4 or 5 games, maybe even more than that, you'll go and play this and get a board full of dudes after a sweeper. Like, I'm into it, but I still wouldn't craft it, especially at Mythic. This is not worth a Mythic wild card, but you know, if you're really, really into best of 1 and you want to try the learn deck, you basically have to craft a copy of this card because I think it's one of the better lessons. But we'll move on to Strixhaven Stadium. I really like this card. So many people hate it. So many people hate this card. I love it so much, but I'm still going to suggest not crafting any copies of it. I don't think this is a card you have to have. I really don't. And I don't love it from a competitive perspective, but I do think there are competitive things you can do with this card. Like I think a Turbo Fog deck might be into something like this. And then, you just get through the combat damage with a Crawling Barrens or with one of the birds from Alrund's Epiphany or something, and that wins the game for you. I think that this could be an interesting Pillow Fort, Turbo Fog kind of card, but I don't think you need to craft any copies of it. Moving on to Wandering Archaic. This is a very, very interesting card, isn't it? And any deck can play it. Any deck can play this card. Explore the Vastlands is symmetrical, but it only costs 3 mana. It only costs 3, so if you play it in the late game, it's very likely that you get a first crack at whatever card you picked up, right? You get an instant or sorcery. And you gain 3 life. It's not terrible. If you want to play it on turn 3 against aggro, right? And against, creature decks, they might not even find a card in their top 5 that they can pick. But I really like Explore the Vastlands. I like that any deck can play it, even decks that don't usually have access to this kind of selection. I think that's cool. I think it's the better card than Wandering Archaic, but Archaic's cool too. 5 mana 4/4 is not amazing stats, especially vanilla, but it's French vanilla. This tax effect is unbelievable. It's a really good tax effect. But I do imagine a lot of the time your opponent's just going to burn 4 mana on a Heartless Act because, if they left all their mana open for your turn, what's really the difference between a 2 mana and a 4 mana Heartless Act if you tapped out to play Archaic? There's really no difference for them. It might keep them off of playing Behold the Multiverse or something like that. Or, if they don't have any creatures out, they don't care if you get to copy a Heartless Act, right? So there's that too. They just pay you the 2 for it, let you copy it, and well, you don't really have any targets. So, I don't think Archaic is as cool as it looks, but it is a really, really neatly designed card. I'm going to suggest 0 for now, but I do think that if there's a colorless card in this set that ends up seeing some amount of play, it might be Explore the Vastlands and Wandering Archaic. This is a really, really neat card with some interesting clauses on it, to say the least. But move on to the lands here, and these are the last things. Yeah, the last few things. Shine, Shadow, Snarl, and all the other snarls. Probably one of the more controversial things I'm going to say in this whole stream. Don't craft these. Don't craft them until you know for a fact that they see play. Right now we have Pathways in the format, which do not work very well with these. We do have Triomes and Snow Duels in the format, which nominally work well with these. In terms of appearance, they work well with these. But you know what's really awkward? Turn 1 Snarl, and I don't have a 1-drop. Turn 2 Triome that's tapped. That's so awkward. It feels so bad. So even though these technically work with Triomes, I still think it's kind of awkward to play them with Triomes, right? So I'm just not super convinced that these are worth a craft immediately, which is good. If you're going to craft them, I think that most decks won't play more than a couple of copies of them. Some decks will play all 4 copies, right? You're going to have decks that effectively are 2-color aggro decks or something like that, and they'll play 4 copies of their Snarl, and they'll play 4 copies of their Pathway, and they'll just suck it up because the rest of their lands are basic lands. So I think these will see play. I just want to know which ones see play and in what numbers before you go crafting any of them. So I wouldn't bother with these for the first week of the format. Wait and see where things fall and how many people actually play what versions of them before you spend mana on them, or wild cards. I'd say if you're going to spend wild cards on any of these to begin with, it's probably Necro Blossom, the green-black one. That one is very good. And then the red-white one, because again, these decks, like the Boros aggro deck or the sort of green-black mid-range deck that doesn't play a 3rd color, will probably want these, But all in all, I would wait. I would wait on that. Hall of Oracles is surprisingly expensive, if I'm not mistaken. Let me take a look here real quick. Oh, it's $2. Well, but this one, why is this one $70? Why is the full art one $70? That's so weird. I don't know why that is, but Hall of Oracles actually kind of looks really good. I'm going to say to craft 0 copies of this, but honestly, I think there's going to be some decks that want to play one of this. Like Sprite Dragon probably wants a one of this, or like if mono white Magecraft is a thing, probably wants this card. It very likely fits a few copies of this, if, at least one, right? Like if mono white Magecraft is a thing, 1 copy of this card is going in that deck. But the deck probably still wants like Faceless Haven and stuff. And you can't play all of the colorless lands in the world. So I don't think you play a million Hall of Oracles, but I do think it's a card that's going to see fringe play in a deck or two, especially monocolored aggro. So kind of like it. Kind of like Hall of Oracles, but I probably wouldn't, craft any until a couple of weeks. And even then, I'd probably only craft one of these. The Biblioplex, I'm crafting 1 copy of this when it comes out, and probably no more. Again, I think a lot of control decks that could take advantage of a card like this are going to be like 3-color decks, right? Although there's a Dimir deck right now that plays almost literally nothing but instants and sorcery. I think it plays Shark Typhoon. That's like the only non-instant or sorcery, non-land card in the entire deck. So a deck like Dimir might really, really like this card. But even 3-color aggro decks, I think will probably crunch one of these into the deck, or 3-color control decks rather. Will probably crunch one of these into the deck just because it's so good in that deck. You know, very often you're going to have 0 cards in your hand, and there's ways you can cultivate your hand to get 7 cards in it. You know, you got 6 cards, just cast Behold the Multiverse, or you got 5 cards, Behold the Multiverse in exile, cast Behold the Multiverse EOT, and then Biblioplex with the rest of your mana EOT. So there's a lot of situations where control decks could easily use this card. And I do think that this new translation, the actual translation on the card, does improve its playability a little bit because it's a May ability. If you don't put the card into your hand, you may put it into your graveyard. So for 2 mana, tap. You don't have to put the card into your graveyard if it's not an instant or sorcery. You can just put it right back on top like a pseudo scry. And I think that May ability makes the card a little bit more playable. I would probably craft at least 1 copy of this, but very likely no more. Yeah, altogether not too bad. What is that, 19, 11 mythics? 17 rares, 11 mythics, which is an awful lot. But I do think you could cut down on light scribes. There's a couple of mythics you could cut out there that I don't think would really matter if you cut them out. So altogether, I think that's probably fewer day 1 cards than a lot of sets that I'd like you to craft, but it's probably comparable to Kaldheim. I think if I was going to do one of these videos for Kaldheim, I would probably recommend about the same number of cards be crafted. So, you know, I hope that this kind of helped, and that this was a little further evaluation into the set that gave you some new ideas, or maybe just kind of made it more clear where I stand on these cards from a purely competitive point of view. Sometimes I get excited about cards for jank reasons because I love janky, stupid decks that do janky, stupid, slow 4-card combos. And I get excited about that just as a Magic player. But looking at it through a purely competitive lens, there's not a whole lot in this set that I think is absolutely must craft on day 1. Although there are some cards I think could break out.